I was one of many people who were surprised with how the race turned out on the primary night. Did you see this primarily as an affirmation of you or rejection of Chris Abele?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was a combination of both. I think that there was, obviously we reached out to a lot of people. We went across the county. When we were running, we got signatures from every single zip code. We've gotten hundreds of donations. We got thousands of people signing on to our campaign. So we've reached a lot of people, but we didn't reach everybody. And so there's people we absolutely didn't talk to who voted for us because they wanted a direction.
He was everywhere in terms of TV and mailers. I think I got a dozen mailers from him.
Yeah.
So if you had to say one or the other, would you say it was primarily an affirmation of your agenda or a rejection of him?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitively, I mean, I think the race, when you're running against an incumbent, becomes a referendum on that incumbent. But our challenge is to make sure we're bringing forward a positive agenda, and we've done that. I've stood up for working families. I've been doing that for my entire career. And so when people are taking a look at what the alternative is, I've got an 8-year career where I've been standing up for working families.
So you used to be a supporter of Chris Abele when he first ran, is that correct?
Right, yeah, absolutely.
What are the one or two reasons that you're no longer supporting him, and not just no longer supporting him, you've decided to run against him?
Yeah, I mean, you have to think back to where we were 5 years ago, and that was where Scott Walker had moved out of the office, and this really was a referendum on who is closer to being like Scott Walker. And in that sense, Jeff Stone, of the same party, someone who was endorsed by Scott Walker, obviously fit that. And I always like to compare it to like after you get out of a bad relationship, and most people have gotten out of a bad relationship, and just about anything looks better. And I think at that point, we weren't asking the tough questions as electeds, as leaders, and as voters, and we rushed into the arms of this guy. I mean, what could go wrong? He's rich, right? And it was only over time that we realized, wait a second, this guy wasn't as good as he was selling himself, or we thought he was.
Do you think he deceived you, or do you think you guys didn't ask enough questions?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of both, right? I mean, for example, the biggest thing that he ran on was saying we're going to end the perks for elected officials, right? He said we're going to stop using
cell phones
and cars. Right, exactly. And then he over time he ended up justifying why that's okay for him to do. He said he was going to shrink the size of the executive's office, and he's grown it, more than Scott Walker did. And the list goes on. And I think the big problem is that he's consolidated this power. Yes, people voted against the county board and voted to make them more part-time. But what that wasn't was an affirmation of him, and I think he's taken it that much further, where he's trying to collect and consolidate a lot more power, and that was the final straw for me.
One poll before the election showed that his favorables were around 30%, his negatives around 43%. What's driving the negatives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that he has gathered all of this power for himself as an autocrat, and he has made himself out of touch, right? I think us in Milwaukee, we like to see our public officials. We like to see them out in the community doing public listening sessions. When we reach out to them, we want them to reach back out to us and give us an answer to a question that we've got and make themselves available. He hasn't done that. Outside of the last 6 months where he suddenly had this election year, suddenly he's found himself again and wants to be back in the public again. But before that, he hasn't explained why he's looking for all this power. He hasn't been out there that much. And I think that in and of itself, along with all of the policies that he's done, have been out of touch with what Milwaukee County really wants.
Let's talk about what you want to do.
Yeah.
You've laid out an agenda for your first 100 days. What exactly do you want to do in those first 100 days?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's going to get the ball rolling on problems that we've seen over the last, this administration, but the previous administrations. We haven't had a long-term vision in a while. And so the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're going out and listening to just about everybody, right? We want to do public listening sessions in each of the municipalities. And that's something we want to set every single year. So we'll start by
a junior version of Russ Feingold.
It is, on a local level, exactly. Yeah, and so if he can do it on the statewide level, I think we can do it at the local level with 19 municipalities. But it's important to have that conversation so that people know both what we are thinking, what we are doing, but can also say, look, here's where I think we should go, here's what I think we should be doing, and be a part of that.
So listening sessions, what's next?
Number one. Number two is making sure that we're going to Madison to repeal the power grabs, right? And so that has to do with the takeover of MPS. We're going to say we don't want that legislation. We'd rather have schools get the funding that they need and stop doing this divide and conquer, pursuing the latest fad that education people who are against public education are looking at. That also includes the power grab to be able to do land sales nearly unilaterally, right? Where this power that he asked for has been consolidated in his office without county board approval. That includes the sale of the airport, the zoo, the museum, and we found out about 43 parks. People hear about that, they do not like it. And so we would go to Madison to make sure we're repealing that.
You would do that in the first 100 days?
Yes, probably within the first week, yeah.
The general session ends April 7th or so?
It does.
You would take office after that?
It does, yeah, it does.
So how would you be able to do that in your first 100 days?
Well, we've already written the bills, and so they're already out there, and so it's easy for them to pass them if they decide to come back in session, right? And they could come back into session if they choose.
Right.
And the way the Assembly adjourned actually right now, they adjourned with the ability to come back if they want to, if they need to. And this could be one of them, especially considering a lot of these bills were written specifically with Abele as county executive in mind. But they might be willing to change their mind once we have a new
It's
county
not a
executive.
surprise that you're a Democrat, and Madison right now is run by Republicans. You see the Assembly or the
Is
Senate
it?
coming back and saying, yes, we want to pass these bills because the new county executive in Milwaukee wants these.
They might. I mean, they've written these bills, and when you talk to the authors, they say like, look, this is something that your county executive wanted, that Abele wanted, and even the night of the election,
He didn't ask for the school bill.
That's what he's claiming. But they worked with him directly. They went to him and said, "Are you willing to do this?"
Because they went to the mayor first, as I understand it,
Right.
who rejected it, and then went to the county executive.
Right, that's my understanding as well. And so even though he's saying that he wasn't part of the crafting of it, he was a willing partner in working with them. And I mean, to be clear, if he wasn't there willing to work with them, I don't think they would have the same legislation. They wouldn't have the takeover. I don't know if they would have written it. I don't know if they've written it in a different way or what, but having him as an able partner allowed it to happen.
So listening sessions, legislation, what's the third thing?
The third thing is making sure we're going and listening to the employees of Milwaukee County, looking for new efficiencies, seeing what we can do in the county better, also making sure that they are, as our front line, front of what Milwaukee County government is, making sure that they know that they're appreciated and they can have a direct line to the county executive's office. So that when they have an idea, they can bring it to us. Or if they have a problem, they can bring it to us and we can look at addressing it. Which is in contrast to some of the stuff that we've heard, and people, it's not the same as like a Dan Bice column where people send you anonymous tips, but people send us anonymous tips about what's happening in county government, and they're not happy, and they're feeling like that they're muzzled from telling the truth about what's going on.
Let's go back to number 2.
Hold on.
Go ahead.
But the other piece of the third one is also making sure that we're attracting the best and the brightest, right? And so attracting good department heads who are experts in their field, people who are going to work to further the economy in Milwaukee County, creating good paying jobs, and people who are going to serve the public. And it's not necessary to have a loyalty test to the county executive, but it's important to make sure that they're serving our neighbors.
Back to the second one.
Yeah.
You mentioned these power grabs by the county executive. The legislation went through. What would you do about Act 14, which stripped the county board of much of its power and consolidated much more power in the county executive's hands? Would you be in favor of going back to Madison, asking them to try to repeal that, have another referendum on this?
Yeah, pieces of it. I respect the results of the referendum that says that they want the county board to be part-time and to cut their pay. That's obvious that the people have spoken on that. And as the executive, you have to administer the law as it stands.
But there's much more to that bill than just that.
Right, exactly. And so those pieces that passed that were not up for referendum, I think those are pieces where I would work with the county board, maybe sign a memorandum of agreement to be able to say, look, let's make sure that there is a balance. When there are appointments that are important to the public, that the county board gets a say and gets to vet them and get to ask about what their motivations are, what they intend to do, and make sure that they're responding to the legislative branch. That to me is important. We'd have to look piece by piece of what's all in Act 14, but they weakened them. They weakened the legislative branch quite a bit, and I think the unforeseen or foreseen consequence of that was that the public got cut out of a lot of decisions. So.
A topic that's on a lot of people's minds right now is the Mitchell Park domes. You said you're in favor of repairing it. I haven't heard you say how you would pay for that. How would you pay for repairing the domes?
Yeah, I mean, to start off, there's different things that we could have done to prevent this situation, right? When there was a surplus, there was $5 million that was put forward as saying, let's address this ongoing deferred maintenance in the parks.
But $5 million is not going to do it now.
They would have started, right? But Abele vetoed that. And when it continued to move forward, there was a $500,000 allocated specifically for the domes, and the current county executive refused to sign that one, right? So there's different things we could have done to address this beforehand. Now that we're in the situation, I would argue, due to a lot of mismanagement by this county executive, we'll have to address it head on. I, as a Milwaukee County resident and somebody who's lived here his whole life, I mean, I have the same reaction I think a lot of my neighbors did, which is like, this is a part of our soul of who we are as Milwaukee County, right? The same reaction as the hundreds of people who showed up last Wednesday night and
But
said,
the figure is enormous.
It.
And we're talking about $75 million or so.
Yeah, I feel like that estimate is inflated, and I don't necessarily trust that as being an honest assessment of exactly what needs to happen. The numbers that I've seen and the other people that I've talked to said it could probably be done for $15 million per dome, which adds up to about $45 million. So we look at competitive bidding and figuring out what it's going to take to make sure we're rebuilding these things. I think we can do it for a fraction of what they're saying.
Would you need a new funding source to help pay for this?
Well, we'd have to work and see exactly what our fiscal situation is. If we need to borrow to be able to make sure we make it happen, that's on the table. If we can work for federal money to make sure that this happens, that's on the table. Or work with the state, right? I mean, even the Journal-Sentinel has come out in favor of trying to make sure that there's regional funding for regional public goods and regional entertainment. And I would argue the domes definitely fit that. So we're going to look regionally to try and figure out how to pay for this.
When you were a Milwaukee County supervisor, you pushed pretty hard for a sales tax increase that would be dedicated to parks, transit, and other things.
Yeah.
Are you still supportive of that?
Yes, very much so. And the reason...
And that would be how much of an increase?
So when we passed the referendum, when the public passed the referendum, over 200,000 people voted for it.
52-48.
Right. But, you know, I remember I was brand new on the county board at the time, and everyone said, don't push a sales tax, no one's going to vote for that, don't you know this town? And I said, no, I think if you explain what it's going to go for, people will go for it. And they did, right? And it passed. And it was for parks, transit, emergency medical services, and property tax reduction.
Right.
And unfortunately, it was only advisory because the Milwaukee County doesn't have the authority to do it on its own. So it had to go to the state. The state started to. I mean, I don't know if you want to go over the whole history of it. I remember it.
You don't have to do that. But
yeah.
The sales tax is considered a regressive tax by many people. You're a liberal Democrat. Mm-hmm. How do you fit that together, justifying an increase in the sales tax?
I remember thinking that exact same thing when this thing came up, of thinking this is regressive because it's going to impact people who are lower income. That's true nationally, but in Wisconsin specifically, it's not as true. And the reason is because if you look at people who are struggling in poverty or at the poverty line and where they spend their money, most of what they spend it on is not subject to a sales tax. So think about it. If you are in poverty, you spend your money on rent. That's not subject to a sales tax. You spend it on transportation, on gasoline. That already has an index tax in it. It doesn't get hit by additional sales tax. You have groceries. That's not subject to a sales tax. And you also have medication, medicine, and services. None of those are subject to a sales tax. And if you add all those things up, that makes up a majority of what people who are struggling are paying for. And on the opposite side, there's this piece that 1/3 of the funds that come in from sales tax, the money generated, comes from outside of the county, right? So people coming in are helping to pay for this. And then the third piece that convinced me was those are the same people who stand to benefit the most, right? Is people who are going to suddenly have a quality park in their neighborhood where they might not have one now. People are going to find it that much easier to connect to jobs once we can expand transit routes and look at lowering fares so they can do it more affordably.
So it would be you would like to see a sales tax very similar to the one that you had the advisory referendum on.
Correct.
And you would do that how quickly?
So we would have to go to the state for enabling legislation, and I have my note that says that Republicans are in charge of the Capitol from you earlier. But here's the thing. The other counties across the state, they are starved for revenue as well, for whether it's where they want to build roads or where they want to provide different services, and they've tapped the sales tax that was available to them. And I think the number is now 60 of 72 counties have tapped into that. And so what I would work for is working with other counties to say, give us this referendum authority, and we'll go out there and we'll sell it to the public again.
Okay. And talking about taxes still, Chris Abele has made it an emphasis that he has not increased the property tax during his 5 years. The county board has increased it. He's then worked off of that. Would you have a similar policy to him where you would not increase the property taxes?
Whose policy does that sound really similar to, Dan?
It sounds a little bit like Scott Walker's policy.
Right. Yeah.
So do you want to follow Scott Walker's policy
No.
on property taxes?
No, and I get it's a show that I think is worn out, right? It's run its series and it's due for cancellation, right? This idea that the county executive goes up there and says, we haven't raised property taxes with a big asterisk that says from the year prior of whatever the county board raised it to. Right. And then we go through this whole routine where the county raises it a little bit, the county exec condemns them, and then they use it the next year.
So what's the new episode? What's the new TV show if you win?
Thanks for extending the analogy. I'd say the new one is actually let's have an honest conversation about where our taxes are and what we're going to spend them on, and also about where our services are, where our quality of life is. But just going out there and pretending that property taxes aren't going up by saying we're going to beat up on the county board for raising it while embracing the taxes that they increase, it's worn thin. And the fact is, and maybe you don't know this, but as Abele is talking about how he hasn't raised property taxes, the fact is property taxes as a percentage have gone up higher at the county than they have at the city of Milwaukee under Tom Barrett.
Your answer is probably going to make some people nervous because it's not a hard and fast rule. You said you're going to just see how things are and then we'll determine. So how can we trust you not to come in as a tax and spend liberal and start pushing up the property taxes right away?
Yeah, I mean, look, I've lived here my whole life. I'm a homeowner. And we're going to have to make sure we're having an honest conversation about where it's going. We'll be out there in the public and see what people are comfortable with. You know, my bottom line is to keep it as close to inflation as possible moving forward. My big goal is to try and make sure we're switching to additional revenue streams like the sales tax. Milwaukee County has among the lowest sales taxes in the entire country. So trying to shift that while lowering property taxes is going to be my goal. But in the meantime, dealing with the tools that we have, trying to keep it as close to inflation as possible is my goal.
Let's take a couple questions from people who submitted questions for you before you got here. First, if elected, would you serve a full 4-year term? Can you pledge that you wouldn't run for governor is the question.
Oh my God, I scared my wife. My plan is to make sure we're serving the full 4-year term, and I think it's enough of a challenge running against the guy who's got bottomless pockets.
Two, what can you as a candidate tell people about to convince them that you can run a large organization given your rather limited executive experience in the past?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I've took the route that most people in executive positions have, which is you start at the bottom and you work your way up. I started as a county board supervisor, so I have some knowledge of the county. I've worked at the state level as a state senator, earned the trust of my colleagues to become their leader, one of the youngest ones since the 1930s, and have an ability to work with people and trust good people to work for me. That's a path that if you look around, most of the mayors in Milwaukee County have followed. And if you look at the heads of organizations, that's where most people who become heads of organizations come from. Not the other way, which is you use your vast wealth to be able to purchase a seat of power. And I think, look, my knowledge of how I've come up, born here, raised here, lived here, and worked my way up will do me well. And I think it's also important to recognize those things that I don't know and go to the public and go to experts to rely on them, right? It's the habits of the smartest people to hire people who are smarter than you in those areas that you might not have knowledge of.
Agree or disagree with Abele on removing the Esterbrook Dam?
So this is one where back when I was a county supervisor, we did a public hearing.
Right.
And we heard from the public, and the public was in favor of keeping it at the time. Since then, and the scientists came forward and said that the science said that we should keep it at the time. So that's the way the board voted, that's the way that we went. That was 6 years ago, 7 years ago now. And
so where are you now?
And since then, I think that the public has taken notice of this. I think the public has moved. I think the scientific opinions have moved. But in the course of the campaign, I haven't had the time to completely drill down. So I'd say that, look, the squabble that's happening between the county board and the county exec on this, if that's not settled by the time we get in there, we will do that public listening session.
So you don't have a position now?
My position is to make sure we are listening to the public on this, listening to the scientists on this, and making sure it's 100% clear. And it seems that the public is in the camp of tearing this down, but I want to make sure for sure. If that's the case, we'll do it by the end of the year.
Is this because you're close to Theo Lipscomb, the county board chairman, who's very much in favor of rebuilding it, but the environmentalists today are against rebuilding it? Is that you're between two constituencies there?
I'd say, look, I have the endorsement of Sierra Club. My pathway into politics is through environmental politics, and yeah, I am friends with Theo Lipscomb. And whenever this comes up, he knows that my position has moved on this, and he knows this will be one of our biggest fights. If it's not settled by the time I get into office, if I'm lucky enough to get into office, we're going to make sure, again, to listen to the public, listen to the scientists, and see exactly where they're at before moving forward. But yeah, my best guess is, from what I've heard on the campaign trail, that this position has moved, and the dam is probably going to be gone by the end of the year, but we got to check to make sure.
Two more questions. Popular ones, you get asked by a number of people about your old shoplifting ticket.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that? You and I talked about this 8 years ago.
We did.
And now it's back since you're running for office again. What can you tell people about that?
Yeah, well, I could say now you're off the hook from all those people who badger you for not beating me up on it enough. There you go. You get it on every 8 years. I'd say, look, I think it was a big mistake when I did it originally. 19. And so I was a freshman in college, struggling to pay bills, and it was groceries. And I've accepted it as a mistake, right? And I went through a class where they ended up dismissing it. I had a judge that allowed that to happen. And the only reason it came up at all is because I decided to run for office. And it's one of these things that, every politician knows that, look, if you're going to run for office, Dan Bice is going to dig through everything that you've got. But what's been amazing is how embarrassed I was at first, because I didn't tell anybody about it at the time. But what's been amazing is how many people who've come forward since then and said that they went through a similar experience and had a judge that gave them a second chance, or that they screwed up in some way in their life, but they used the opportunity to move forward. And or maybe they didn't have a judge who gave them that second chance and they went down a different path. And what that's allowed me to do is to be able to look at my neighbors in a very different sense, because everybody has secrets. And as much as politicians, sometimes people hold them up as being, holier than thou and infallible, we are absolutely not. We are human, right? And we also serve our neighbors who are also human. So it gives me the chance to look into their eyes and realize that it's only a few turns that I could be in just about anyone else's shoes that I serve as a politician.
Do you get tired of hearing the issue?
I did at first, but I think it's one of those where it's like it's part of who I am now. Okay. And I've said it because there's people who've done better, there's people who've done worse, and the people who like to talk about it the most, people are probably not going to vote for me anyways, and they're just looking for an excuse.
Last question. Do you regret going to Illinois to try to stop Act 10 from passing?
No, I don't. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to make sure that the public had a chance to be heard on that issue. It was clear at the time that the public wasn't as aware of what was happening at the state capitol. Everyone was obsessed with the Packers. We had just won the Super Bowl, so they weren't super tapped in. And we also had some horrible snow that winter, and so the news was not really covering what was happening at the Capitol. And I think in that sense, he came forward with this bill. And if you remember, he said it was a budget repair bill. And we said this is absolutely not that. This is going at the heart of public sector unions, public sector employees as a political punching bag. So we stepped away from the state so that the public could have a chance to be heard. And I think had we not done that, you wouldn't have had this, the David Koch phone call that revealed that, yep, this had nothing to do with the budget,
so
had everything to do with politics.
Same situation again, you would do it again?
I don't think we'll ever have that same situation again. I think that Scott Walker has adjusted as a politician in realizing how to pick his fights. I think Democrats have adjusted in how we react to things. And I think that the public now has changed in how it's reacting. But yeah, at the time, I don't regret it. I think it was something that look, I've stood up for working families, and I'll do that whether I have to go to Illinois or whether it's in Madison or whether it's here in Milwaukee County. I'll go wherever the fight takes me as somebody who's standing up for working families.
So thanks for coming in and talking to us at JS on Politics, and we'll return with Chris Abele in a bit. Thank you.
Thank you.